calling Pesticides and Health an in-depth discussion. I'm hoping a few more people come in, but all of our panelists are here. I did want to make maybe one or two comments about some of the things you heard about already this morning as it relates to some of the activities of Beyond Pesticides. The first is we have been working for at least 5, maybe 6 or 7 years to get triclosan banned through every possible mechanism. And Jay and I were very excited to hear about the presentation on triclosan because it's one more, hopefully, nail in the coffin of triclosan because it needs to go. As you heard, it's in everything. The other is Jay Feldman is on the National Organic Standards Board. I think that may have already been mentioned. But there's some really important stuff that comes up in the NOSB. The one that he will actually be discussing next week in Portland is the fact that for a disease called fire blight that affects apples and pears and is susceptible to antibiotics for many years, both in chemical agriculture or industrial agriculture, as Joe calls it, and in organic, antibiotics have been used to treat fire blight in apples and pears. And for a lot of reasons related to the requirements of the organic law, use of antibiotics for this purpose was supposedly going to be phased out by next year. And next week, we'll be considering a petition, or the organization will be considering a petition to extend the phase out of use of antibiotics in pear and apple production. And of course, we strongly resist that for some of the reasons you heard Dr. Foreman's talk. But also we're getting strong support from the Infectious Disease Society of the United States, who will be presenting testimony in opposition to this extension. But it's really quite crazy that we're putting the drug that's used most commonly is oxytetracycline, which is a very useful antibiotic for some very serious human diseases. And in fact, sort of in the context of a lot of the stuff you've already heard in this conference, if you expose a lot of bacteria to a lot of oxytetracycline, then you get resistant. And the people that work in those fields are going to acquire those resistant organisms, and they're going to spread them, throughout. So this is a very hot topic, and it relates to some work before that was talked about earlier. So, as we have organized this conference, it's been the idea that, these are things that we're really interested in and trying to pursue as an organization. I want to enlist all of you. One of the things that we do, and if you link to us through Facebook or the website, when these sorts of things are coming up, we ask you to comment on them. Because they're actually, on this particular issue, there's been a petition, how many, 50,000? There's something like 50,000 people that signed on the petition, but the people that want to continue to use the tetracycline says, how do we even know that somebody didn't put their names up and they didn't really do it? So the thing that tends to actually do better is if you write your own comments about why this is a bad thing. And we send out alerts. So So get involved with our system through the website, through Facebook, get our listserv, so when we send out these alerts, and we need you to participate in this process, you can do it. At any rate, that's just a side effect. I think you have met all of the participants in this conference, and they've all been introduced, so I'm not going to introduce them except Dr. Porter. Warren Porter, who actually moderated the last session, is a professor of zoology and environmental toxicology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research has shown that combinations of commonly used agricultural chemicals and concentrations at near levels found in groundwater can significantly influence immune and endocrine systems as well as the neurological health of animals. His recent research links pesticide exposure in utero to impaired learning, changes in brain function, and altered thyroid levels. Anyway, you go on and on. Warren's done a lot of neat research that we hear about in our board meetings and elsewhere. So we want this to expand on what we talked about earlier, answer your questions. I wish they'd set it up so that everybody could, who was on our panel, could participate. Maybe that would be a good idea for the four of you. And I'll just hand the microphone around as things come up. Lynn, can you? Yeah, good idea. Y'all are smarter than I am. You know how to do this. I don't know if any of you want to add additional comments to what you did in your presentations before we get into this. Anybody?
There was one, at the very end of mine, I had something I was trying to say and I forgot it, but it was about the cost differential. I just wanted to mention programs that try to equalize that for people who don't have the economic ability to buy as more expensive organic. So I want to mention the New York City Health Bucks program. Although small, it could be larger, is great. Has anybody heard of it? No. Health Bucks is a program that the Department of Health started to try to equalize buying power for people who are poor. So there's more than 120 farmers markets now in New York City. And I can say I moved there in 1990. The whole food landscape has changed. It should continue to change more. But the farmers markets program and the fruit and vegetable cart program, for which there's now over 1,000 permits for fruit and vegetable carts throughout the city, have been just wonderful. It's changed the availability, so these food deserts are less, and access to, and this all mostly local, especially the farmers markets. So it's a direct-to-market pathway there's lots of farmers in New York State, so it's a great way for them to bypass the middleman and for small, farms to sell direct to consumers, and it makes it easier for them to, make a living, I guess. But so the Health Bucks program, which is mostly distributed at those farmers markets for people who have food stamps, essentially, it gives them a 40% bonus in dollars. So they get, for every 5 they spend, they get 2 more for fruits and vegetables. So it's a really neat program. And, we talked about the artificial difference in price, but really, if we priced industrially produced fruits and vegetables where they should be, based upon all the costs, they'd actually probably be much more expensive than organic fruits and vegetables in organic farm, but they're not. A friend of mine in the Department of Health now in New York City used to say $5, $6, $7 a gallon gasoline would be the best thing that could ever happen to this country, because people would make different decisions if the true cost of fuel was reflected in what you pay. Europe is a little better than that, but people will make different decisions if we can equalize that. So I just want to mention that program, and I think that other programs that aim to erase the artificial difference in prices are really important, because then I think if there was no price difference, who wouldn't, right? I mean, if organic was the same cost, who would, really most of the people who would buy, other than the industry who wants to make money off of it, most consumers would choose organic if it wasn't more expensive. So everything we can do to make non-organic food priced at a level that really reflects the cost is a good thing.
Can I ask a question on that? How did the city get behind this effort?
It's a very progressive health department and Board of Health in New York City. I'm happy that I'm now on the Board of Health, which was an amazing thing. It's like the coolest thing I've ever done, I have to say. And a lot of controversy comes out of it, but it's just a very aggressive and progressive Board of Health. So they're well funded. It's really an amazing group of people. And I have to say, under our current mayor has been willing to appoint, I think, really powerful, good commissioners in many areas, not all. And the two Toms that have been Commissioner of Health have both been excellent. And they've been willing to do it. So, how do you keep it going? It doesn't get a lot of press, but they get some. I don't know. I mean, I think, I don't know how to answer your question. How do you get it? New York City's a big city with a lot of money, actually, right? So they've been able to decide this is a worthwhile way to spend their money.
I have an off-the-wall question. How do you think the proposed brain mapping of the function of the brain can be helped to support our interests?
Who wants to tackle that?
God, I don't know how happy I am about that. The only thing I would say about that is I don't understand a lot about it. It's kind of in vogue. The biggest concern I have about that whole new mapping the brain effort that the federal government is pushing now is that it may possibly and very likely gut the funding for the National Children's Study, which I think would do a lot more for our purposes than anything else. And the changes in that and sort of the privatization of the research part have been very distressing.
And the tools they're talking about using are not very mature, so the money they're talking about putting into it hopefully would provide maturation of the tools, but it's a big gamble.
Is it mostly genetic markers? They aren't looking at people, they're just looking at brain genes?
No, they're talking about using things like functional MRI, which looks at which part of the brain lights up when you're doing something, for instance.
Very
And
expensive.
it's very expensive, and you can't actually use, in a few situations, you can use functional MRI to look, for instance, of how specific, at least chemicals of abuse alter brain function. So you can look at how cocaine affects brain function. And those tools have been used, but I tried to get our functional MRI people to look at lead and pesticides with functional MRI, and they said, we can't do it. It just doesn't, because of the way, do you know anything about MRI?
Yeah.
The way it works, they said they couldn't do it.
That's testing poisons on humans.
Well,
You can do it in animals too.
you can do functional MRI in anything, any vertebrate. So it doesn't have to be in humans. And what it's been done in the past,
What has been done in the past has been with people that are already exposed, like drug addicts. And I was proposing to do it in children that I know had been exposed to lead or pesticides to see how badly it had affected them, rather than, I've come out very strongly in the past against intentionally giving pesticides to people, as you may be aware. But where they are being exposed, you can potentially show what the effect is, and as you decrease their exposure, you can see whether there was a change in a positive direction. But they say they're not ready to do it. They don't know the system well enough. Just as an aside, one of the people that does functional MRI where I work has developed a wonderful lie detector. He says that he can detect lying better by functional MRI than any of the known lie detector. And he's been extensively published for that. So it's an interesting tool, but it's not very mature for that purpose.
now, more, go.
Also, MRI is not a magic bullet for everything, because there are certain kinds of molecules that you can't even see with MRI. You'd have to be putting some kind of a special marker or label or some way to attach it to something that you're looking for. NMR or MRI is a very, very useful thing for looking for things across a broad spectrum. For example, my wife is a biochemist and she uses NMR all the time. And one of the things that we've been able to do is to develop a technology that allows us to look for biomarkers of progression of disease, and lately also for the consequences of pesticide exposure. and what we've been able to do with that by looking at small molecules. And that's mostly what you can look at with MRIs, unless you're looking at imagery. But we've been able to fingerprint, actually, atrazine exposure. We've been able to chemically fingerprint nitrate exposure. We've been able to chemically fingerprint in early androgen exposure to a fetus in utero that we can then detect by biomarkers once that infant or that baby is born. And so there are some, and the nice thing about this is that we don't have to be looking for a particular molecule. We simply take a sample of the serum or a sample of milk and nuke it, and this is a 50 microliter serum, so it's a really tiny amount, and nuke it with magnetic pulses of electromagnetic radiation, and you can look at everything that's in there that is in the small molecule category. And we can find out if you do this before and then after exposure, how changes have happened. And you can also then use this to determine how the biochemistry of the organism is being changed by these various insults. This is just in its infancy. We're just about to get the first paper on this published, and another one, actually 2 papers are ready to be published. But it's a very exciting new technology because it can open up all kinds of avenues for exploring the consequences of exposure in a very complex system like the brain.
I just had a comment on what you said. Of course, I agree with you, but I think there's a prejudice in some places about organic. Some years ago, I was looking for organic restaurants in San Francisco. I was going all around because I just wanted to have places to go to. And I found that some of the most expensive places were serving organic and wouldn't put it on their menu. Didn't want to own up to it because maybe most of their customers were from the pesticide industry or something. I don't know, but they didn't like, and then in addition, I was involved with a child care program at UC Berkeley, and parents used to shop for the food. And I found certain products that you could get organic at the local co-op for the same price as the non. And for a few weeks, they did what I suggested, and then after, they just were like, oh, we don't want to follow that fanatic anymore, and they went back to the non-organic. So just, I don't say that's overwhelming, but one should know that, yeah.
So thanks for that comment. I haven't found, that's interesting that a restaurant wouldn't want to advertise, especially a high-end one, because there's pretty good evidence that the higher education tend to be more organic and are attracted to it. So I think it is changing. I do feel like there's a changing view of organics becoming more and more positive. The biggest barrier is, I think, cost and convenience and accessibility. Not convenience so much, but accessibility. One of the reasons why I really like the farmers market program and the food and vegetable cart program in New York City is that it breaks down some of those barriers. There's lots of good research in all kinds of different settings that people are lazy and we do what's easiest, right? So maybe for your clients or whoever it was you were working with, they have to travel 2, 3, 4 extra blocks to get to the place to get the organic.
10 or 15 feet.
10 or 15 feet. Yeah. But in general, we know that people do what's easiest. And so we need to make it the default choice, the easier choice, the healthier choice. And making it cost competitive is one way, and making it just there is another.
Yeah, I'm Cynthia Crone. We're looking at reasons that people choose to eat organic food at the University of Washington, and we have a population of 7,000 people across the U.S. And so we looked at all of the things you might expect that are related to the decision to consume organic food, so income, education, city where you live, age, race, gender, and a lot of those things show up as important predictors, just like you would expect. But if you also look at, if you take a step back and look at the healthy eating literature, so food deserts and the fact that people who live in communities where there's more grocery stores and more fruits and vegetables available, they tend to eat healthier diets. And so what we're finding in organic food is the same thing. If you live somewhere where organic food is accessible, even after controlling for your personal income and education, you're more likely to eat organic food. So 2 people of the same income, even if it's a lower income more likely to eat organic food there.
I have a question, actually. Has anybody actually done a study looking at the big five chemical manufacturers that were mentioned, whether their employees eat organic?
Can you answer that question?
Yeah, it turns out that at Monsanto, it turns out the CEO of Monsanto is a health food freak and an organic guy, and in fact, the whole headquarters building has all kinds of information plastered on the walls and the billboards about how to eat healthy and drink good, clean, pure, filtered water.
I'd like to hear a little discussion, since, you know, the agenda here is to reduce pesticide use, shifting to organic. I'm 100% supportive of that. But, you know, the big lever in the system would be to shift the diet away from meat. Because, as Andrew showed today, so much grain is being used to feed livestock. That entails water, fertilizer, and so on, you know, greenhouse gas emissions and so on. So to me, meat is the big driver in the system, and we know that as countries increase their gross domestic product per person, the meat consumption goes up. That's a global trend. What do you think about that? Should we have that as part of our messaging?
So that's a sustainability question, really, largely, as much as anything.
It's your same question. Are we going to keep using these technologies and toxins to provide, meat at the level that we do now?
Somebody want to deal with that?
We deal with grass-fed in our area. A lot of people are going grass-fed or grain, or not grain-fed, but for the chickens that they do the pasture grazing as opposed to grain-fed.
Yeah, I think the issue too is that all animal production isn't the same. And so if we look at big agriculture, then yes, the use of grains, pesticides are issues. But looking at more sustainable models in terms of the grass-fed industry, which is very concerned about the health of the environment and the health of the soil, focusing on healthy plants as a crucial factor for healthy animals and healthy meat. So all of those things are they're complex issues too. By the way, the director of the Kibera Coalition will be here. That would be a good question to pose to her. She's in another workshop right now, but they've done a great deal of work in terms of sustainability for the environment.
I would like to ask Joel, as a pediatrician that talks to families about diet, and certainly is confronting, as I have, the obesity epidemic in children, what he thinks about healthy eating and how meat comes into that.
I was just going to add, thanks, Rob. It's a huge issue, and I think fundamentally you're correct, basically. I think that, not that we should necessarily, I think that clearly reducing the amount of meat, particularly red meat, that's consumed in our diets is good for everybody. It's good for the issues for pesticides because of the agricultural production that uses lots of pesticides that goes into feeding the cows that we then eat. It's good for obesity because, and probably other health disorders too, like say colon cancer, et cetera, because our diets are just not balanced the way we know they should be, much more heavily in terms of whole grains and fruits and vegetables. So we talk to families about this all the time. My own particular population is a little bit tough in that they have many other acute medical and psychosocial issues, and it's hard to do all this during a visit. The thought, I think pediatrics has a little bit of a problem that it thinks that all the stuff that the doctor says in this very brief visit is how you change people's behavior. And I don't totally agree with that. I think we're asking an awful lot of that relationship. I think that policy changes that make default choices easier. So you talked about alternative, not alternative, but say grass-fed or true free range, not like you had 2 seconds of free, they opened the window to the poultry.
Yes.
Right? But really, the chickens like we imagined were running around, right? That would work if that was, it became more prevalent for 2 reasons. One is the meat is likely to be healthier and less fatty. I'm convinced that true free-range chicken tastes a lot very anecdotal. But also, it would be more expensive. There's no question that meat raised that way is generally more expensive than the massive industrial production now, which is good, right? Because people will eat less of it and choose more fruits and vegetables. Because meat should be a special, small part, if you believe in having meat in your diet, and not such a large part of our diet. So I think it's a big challenge.
I think there's another thing that could be used to help induce people to switch their meat-type diet, is to a grass-fed thing, and that is that grasses have a great deal of CLA in them, conjugated linoleic acid, and this has many, many kinds of health effects, including immune function effects, memory effects, brain function effects that are all beneficial. And I'm not so sure that grass-fed is going to be more expensive than corn-fed. It will be as long as we're subsidizing the big producers, but as prices go up, that's going to change. And people always are looking to try to improve their health, and so if you can argue and point out that grass-fed stuff is so much more healthy, then you could shift it that way.
I was just going to, the sort of political decision about where Beyond Pesticides should focus, I mean, that's very complicated, but I would be a little wary of diluting the focus of Beyond Pesticides to start talking too much about vegetarian or vegetarian diets. And just not because it's not correct, but just because it has such a great focus, and keeping your messages clear and short and few in number and simple helps raise the profile and credibility of Beyond Pesticides. So those are hard decisions, and you're right, it's all connected, but I actually think chemicals management and chemical regulations is more directly connected with the mission that we've been talking about here. And actually, we haven't had a discussion about it, but we do think so backwards with chemicals, right? We're talking about, now we have the evidence to ban this antibacterial, right? But what are they going to substitute for it? That has not been studied. And why would they be allowed to put another substitute chemical out there before it's been studied, before it's been released? And that's because our chemicals management policy is backwards. All the onus is on you to do this amazing research and take years and years and prove and finally get it pulled, which probably eventually will be successful, only to be replaced by yet another hundreds of chemicals that have never been tested before they're used. So I think that issue is so relevant and of a greater priority.
I have a couple of things to say. One is, if you eat less meat, you may be eating, to compensate for it, more soy. So is it going to be GMO soy? Maybe. And even if not, soy has phytoestrogens in it, which can disrupt the endocrine system as well. And the other thing I would like to say is the actual legal definition of a concentrated animal feeding operation is, it allows a really large segment of that industry to be ignored. For instance, there's a chicken house, shall we call it, in our area, which doesn't have enough animals in it to qualify. And yet you can look at it and you can see that the animals have decimated the vegetation there, and it's essentially a concentrated animal feeding operation, but legally doesn't qualify. And so it doesn't have to be regulated like that. One of the things that they do in that chicken house is they feed the animals a feed-through insecticide called cyromazine, and the metabolite of that actually finds its way into the chicken meat and the eggs is melamine. Remember that one? Okay. And it's a chitin synthesis inhibitor that prevents the fly larvae from maturing in the manure. So that's why they do that. That's right. And they also use it in cattle operations. Same reason, fly control.
For lobsters.
Yeah. So it turns out our exposure to melamine is on the order of 2 or 3 parts per billion, and that is already enough to start a little bit of cellular damage. Everything's connected to everything. Isn't that so true?
Along those lines, I was wondering, through Dr. Petz's talk, about the structure of some natural antibacterials. How different are they? How artificial is triclosine? Maybe that's a primitive question.
Well, it depends how far out you want to use your imagination. Original lead was actually not the PCBs or the flame retardant PDEs. This is where you have a company with a colleague that you have nothing in common with. You have a conversation, say, what do you do? They say, well, I'm a natural products chemist. And you say, oh, that's great. What do you study? And they say, well, I study sponges that may have, chemicals that would be useful for treating secondary infections in AIDS patients. And that's what they were funded to do. We were studying calcium channels, and that kind of bored him. But then we got on the thing, well, what kind of compounds do you look at? And he says, well, sponges are notorious for putting bromines onto organic molecules. And so I said, we always wanted to find compounds with these kinds of activities, but we want really potent ones, and we haven't been very successful using scorpion toxin screens, so do you have anything we can test? And he said, well, I just came back from a trip to Western Australia where we collected little bits of sponge. We extract them, and we have extracts. Do you want to look at them? So I had an American heart student for the summer, 3 months. We had developed an assay and said, okay, we're looking for this kind of activity. Why don't you just screen 128 species? They did. Number 10 hit, and number 15 hit. And the one that hit in our particular assay that was relevant to triclosan was a group of chemicals known as essentially brominated bastidins from Ianthelobasta. That's as far as people know, and they're 4 tyrosine molecules that are brought together into a big structure, and it's a known structure. And the organic chemists the natural products chemists would divide them northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere because it was a dipeptide, and they thought that was really what made them active. Well, it turns out that it was the eastern and western hemisphere which were brominated diphenyl ethers, which means that there were 2 brominated diphenyl ethers that come together in a ring, and those were the parts of the molecules that were active, which led us not only to PCBs, but PBDEs. I had no idea what triclosan was until it hit in our assay, and we looked at the structure, and it was so clear to us. Is it like an existing antibacterial? Well, obviously, the brominated bastidins have antifungal activity, so they are antibiotics of sorts. Why the sponge makes them? We think they're defense molecules, not antibiotics, but maybe that's how they use it. So that's the link with triclosan. How triclosan relates to other antibiotics that might be out there that are natural, I don't know of any. So it's a real gem.
Isn't one of the, just to follow up on the antibiotic, I was under the impression that the real reason there's antibacterials in all these consumer products is just all about marketing. That there's, my feeling was that there's really very little evidence that there's a health benefit to having antibacterial soap and all of this stuff. That it's just that they can charge more for it, so the companies make it. It's rather than substituting the next antibacterial, you don't just need plain old soap.
My understanding is that there are studies out there that suggest that in general, antibacterials like triclosan are no more effective than sufficient soap and water, so a certain amount of time under the warm water and friction. So that said, there are some very limited uses of triclosan that are clearly beneficial. So diabetic patients with secondary gingivitis, which is really bad, does resolve with the use of gargle-containing triclosan. But when you think about where it's gone from a very useful application to $1 billion a year single compound that you can sell as value added, and until somebody tells you it's potentially harmful, why would you take it off the market, or why would you limit the use?
And the same for flame retardants, right? The evidence that they actually keep people from being harmed by fire is thin to none.
Correct. So the Swedes have taken a precautionary principle where they look at the chemistry of the material and say, have we learned this lesson before, and should we be more cautious before you put out millions and millions of pounds? Especially like triclosan, it's not in the Superfund site on the other side of town. It's actually coming into homes and it's being intimately consumed, either orally, dermally, virtually every way you can think of, triclosan is there. So how that gets to that point and how do you then get it back to, it's a tough question. I mean, obviously they're fighting it very, very vigorously.
You mentioned precautionary principle. I've heard that before. Can any one of you go into detail of what that would look like if applied in comparison to?
Yeah, we'll just, one second. You've been working on the triclosan?
Yeah, I just had a follow-up comment to Dr.
And then I'll answer your question.
Thank you.
Sorry. Just to follow up on what Dr. Passa is saying, you know, when we look at, I believe one of the questions earlier was whether there should be alternatives to triclosan. You know, what Beyond Pesticides has been saying all this time is the alternative is just plain soap and water. There really is no additional benefit to having triclosan in soaps, the soaps, clothing, toys, you know. Studies have shown that when they looked at bacterial counts on hands washed with either triclosan-based soaps or just regular plain soap and water, they both did comparable jobs. So, you know, what we tell people is just avoid triclosan completely. There really is no additional benefit. In fact, there are more harms than benefits to using triclosan in the wealth of consumer products that are out there.
So what is the precautionary principle? It actually is a bit more relevant to non-pesticide chemicals than pesticide chemicals, because in order to register a pesticide, you have to do some testing and establish a so-called no effect level or no adverse effect level, and then they do some mathematical stuff to figure out how much of a pesticide we should be exposed to. It doesn't work, but there is some testing.
Ignores the inerts.
It ignores it. We've talked about that. Now, in general, chemical use is regulated under something called TSCA, which is the Toxic Substances Control Act. Under that act, which regulates all non-pesticide chemicals, the manufacturers can introduce a chemical into our systems without any evidence of safety, and in order to get rid of it, we have to prove that it's unsafe. What the precautionary principle says is that before a pesticide or other chemical is introduced, we are going to assume it's unsafe until proven otherwise. That's a precautionary principle, rather than assuming it's safe and having to prove it's unsafe. Now, the European Union for chemicals has, for about 5 or 6 years now, been working under something called REACH, which is based on the precautionary principle and saying that all the chemicals in use in the European Union have to be tested for safety before they're going to allow continued use. So the U.S. is way behind on this, on going to this assumption that you got to prove something is safe before you use it. And as we have learned more about the hazards of pesticides, we realize that the present system of looking for toxicity is woefully inadequate. In our board meeting yesterday, we talked about what our coming understanding of epigenetics means to that system, which turns out is probably even worse than endocrine disruptors, because the alterations that we call epigenetics are going to be even harder to study, which throws us way back to saying the best answer to all of this is just say no. And that's the precautionary principle. Now, Warren, do you want to, we got some, are there hot questions here? Or?
Go ahead.
I was just going to let Warren do 2 minutes on what epigenetics is. Do you want to do that? Or not?
Well, you want to do it? I can do it.
I don't pretend to be an expert on it. I can't remember if I actually mentioned.
You do.
Yeah.
Yeah, you had pictures of the stones. That little.
Yeah. I can't remember if I mentioned that when the mother is pregnant with the fetus, did I say this? I was having trouble visioning the text I had. When the mother's pregnant, her fetus is exposed to whatever chemicals are out there that she's exposed to because there's not so much in the way of a placental barrier. And the germline cells of her fetus have already been segregated out. And those are going to be the genes that go to her grandchildren. And they get reprogrammed early on in development. The slate is wiped clean on those epigenetic tags, and then it's reprogrammed. And I want to say magically because I honestly don't understand it. But the field is just rapidly evolving. So those epigenetic marks can be passed down, who knows how many generations. So far, 4 or 5 at least. And did I cover everything? Something more?
I have a simplistic explanation. So look at the non-scientific. So it took me forever to have any understanding of what epigenetics meant. And Robert Wright, who just came to us from Harvard, who's a major environmental health researcher, gave me this explanation, so I want to credit him. So basically, my concept of genetic mutations before I heard about epigenetics was you have a genetic code with the A, T, G, all of the all of the markers, and there's a break in it, and it gets switched. So you get a gene code that is actually changed, codes for a different protein, or it doesn't code for the protein it's supposed to, and then you have a disease because you either have too much protein, too little, missing something.
So that's what we call
That's regular old
mutations,
right? So how could these environmental chemicals change without causing mutations, change your code? But the way, my understanding of the way it works is, so you have your DNA, double helix, that's wrapped around proteins, and it gets compacted and compacted. And stuck onto those proteins are these other groups like, say, methyl groups. And how many of these methyl groups are on, or how acetylated, another way of changing the epigenome, is on, changes which genes are exposed and are active. So it's as if you have a code, but certain parts you kind of hide, and certain parts you open up. And this is how the environment affects genetic expression. And we've probably known about it long. It's been happening forever, but we didn't understand the mechanism. So it opens up this whole other world where a chemical, you start accumulating these bits of little tags on the packaging of your code, which was always there, but now it's either opened or closed or changed in its conformation so that you're making different proteins in different amounts without actually having a mutation and change in the code. And it is true, although I don't understand as well, it can be passed on through germ cells from generation to generation. But it's a very different concept, and it explains how, is it the environment or is it genetics? Well, it's both, and this is one of the main ways, I guess, they work together. You had a nice video of it, though.
Yeah. Well, epigenetics really also, as she pointed out, there are 2 ways to do it, but basically all of these things are simply molecular switches that turn off a gene and sometimes turn it on. And so it's sort of like a massive switchboard or a set of switches on the wall where you can control the lighting in the room, and you flip one switch and you turn off some, you flip another switch and you turn off some others. And essentially, epigenetics is doing that kind of thing. It's adjusting the lighting, if you will, with a simple switch, using a carbon atom and 3 hydrogens attached to it. That's all a methyl group is. And you produce a lot of them in certain metabolic pathways, and then you use them as switches. And it can be tissue specific. You can turn them off on one tissue, but not in another, depending on the way things work.
Okay, there's some good questions I can see.
My question here, I would like to hear from the panelists how each of you may be working with EPA and other agencies in the government that regulate pesticides. We've got all of this great scientific information. You're speaking to the choir here. So how are each of you as scientists working with EPA?
Well, I'll tell you myself, I'll start with me. Right now I'm not. I was, back in the mid-90s, first chair of a committee started by Carol Browner called the Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee. I chaired that for however long they allowed me. I think it was 3 or 4 years. Then we got a new administration, and the Bush administration didn't like my opinions and attitudes, and I got thrown out of EPA, and I've never gotten in again. Although I should say that as an organization, BP does access EPA. We meet with the administrators on a regular basis. Usually with our spring board meeting, we go up and talk to the administrators in the pesticide and chemical branch, and so we're doing our best. And there are people that I know well and work well with who are part of that. My mentee, Jimmy Roberts, is on the PPDC, which is the Pesticide Program Dialogue Committee, and he regularly inputs on that. And Jimmy and I have just finished publishing the 6th edition of Recognition and Management of Pesticide Poisonings, which is now in press and will be out. So, yes. So, yes, we're all working either directly or indirectly to try and alter how, but I don't know about the rest of these folks.
I'll just quickly comment about the Academy of Pediatrics, since that was my role in being here. So what's now called the Executive Committee of the Council on Environmental Health has always had liaisons from EPA. Right now it's Peter Gravatt, and they've been great. There's a small voice in the Office of Children's Health Protection that is a positive voice in EPA. Even through the dark years, there was still some good people there. Our local research unit and fellowship and clinical consulting unit in Children's Health meets every quarter actually with Region 2 EPA, either up at our institution or downtown, and raise issues and raise awareness. So there is at least a back and forth and some communication. I think those people within the EPA who are sympathetic to these issues are dying for someone to scrap TSCA and give them better power. They have no power right now. They're in the same position. The people in there who are good people who want to do something, they've got no tools and no money to do anything about the broad exposure to pesticides. They just don't. They've only banned 5 substances with TSCA since it was created in 1976 or 1979. I mean, it's just it's so toothless. So the best thing we could do is advocate for new chemicals policy so the EPA could be more potent.
You want to talk about the bill? Well, okay.
Well, we have a lot of issues besides pesticides that we're dealing with, including fracking chemicals and other industrial chemicals. And so we put a major effort into our endocrine disruptors list, and we hope that access to the original literature will be very helpful to people. But one of the other things that we do is interact with legislators. What we need is some new legislation, and I want to mention the Safe Chemicals Act, which keeps coming up and doesn't quite make it into law, because TSCA definitely needs reform or done altogether.
Senator Lockwood still championing for it?
Yes.
Yes, still out there. So do you want to talk about Congressman Rush's bill that we've been working with?
Well, first I want to just add that as an organization beyond pesticides, tries to keep the agency engaged on issues that we advocate for.
We all you know who Michelle Harris
Oh,
is.
so I'm sorry. My name is Michelle Harriet. Many of you may have already met me. I am a staff scientist at Beyond Pesticides, and I am responsible for a lot of the regulatory comments that we make to the agency. So, for example, if the EPA puts out a decision on a particular chemical, whether it's a new chemical or a review of a chemical, Beyond Pesticides would make some suggestions and recommendations to the agency, which is basically saying we don't really need these chemicals, you guys are not evaluating and looking at all the studies available. And so we would submit comments. From there, depending on the issue, we may request an audience with the agency. So we do try to have meetings as we see fit. And of course, like Ralph mentioned, during our fall board meeting, we do try to take our board members to the agencies to promote some of the issues that we work on. From there, for some of the issues we work on, we may find it prudent that we take further action. So we may petition the agency to remove a particular chemical from the market, and we've done that with triclosan back in 2010, and the EPA has yet to respond to us. And from there, we may sue the agency, which we are doing with the neonicotinoids, which I think was touched on earlier, clothianidin and thiamethoxam. So we just did that, I think, maybe 2-3 weeks ago. So beyond pesticides, yes, we do try to keep the agency engaged, let them know that we are watching what they're doing and keeping them on their toes.
SEPA.
As for SEPA, actually I'm not very well versed on SEPA, but SEPA is the School Environmental Protection Act, thank you, that BM Pesticides drafted and has been working on for a number of years. It was introduced by our friend, Representative Rush Holt. Was it 2 years ago?
2 or 3, yeah.
Yeah, 2 or 3 years ago, and of course it did not, unfortunately for us, it did not move further because we were not getting a lot of support from other members in Congress. But we continue to work on SEPA. It's something very, very important to us, as you may know. We do want to not have a lot of the harmful chemicals that we're talking about used in schools. And this is a bill that sort of tries to get states to come up with their own policies to remove toxic pesticides from the school environments.
Okay, well, and the rest of you working with EPA? Yeah.
We work with EPA on many levels. They funded our Center for Children's Environmental Health. At least half of the funding comes from US EPA. We work with our local Regional 9, and one of the ways I do that is I sit on the governor's panel for listing pesticides under Prop 65, which is quite an eye-opener.
I have worked with a lot of very good people in the EPA. The people who have been most responsive have in as many of the prior administrations been more at the lower levels. The higher levels are appointees, and that shifts every time the administration shifts. And this is a real problem because most of you know about Citizens United decision, which allows corporations to spend a lot of money on elections. And one of the things that really controls how the EPA functions are the Senate and Agriculture subcommittees in the Congress. And many of the people on those committees are funded in their elections by contributions from chemical industries. And so the chemical industries have a lot to say about what happens in the EPA by means of controlling the budget of the EPA.
It does that in rats, it probably does that in humans. We're talking a couple hundred years. I mean, I would think that if the precautionary principle has any use, that would seem to be the poster child.
Yes.
Absolutely. It's not part of our regulatory structure.
Yeah, the regulatory structure right now doesn't allow use of the precautionary principle. It's been very much resisted by our Congress.
So maybe it's time to get out the pickets.
Yeah, it is. Exactly. That's why you're here, because we need to enlist all of you. There's another.
What was the name of that one? I'm sorry.
Vin Closeland. You can look it up. Very potent endocrine disruptor. It's been extensively. Yes, ma'am.
One federal law that does look at the precautionary principle is the weed law, which allows these guys to be declaring all sorts of weeds dangerous when there's no proof that they're going to be dangerous in the geographic area that they're projecting. And then they go ahead with a lot of pesticide use on it. And that's a precautionary principle application that those guys are getting by with. It's very discouraging to watch.
It's a version of the term, yeah.
Well, you know, you're right, just say you're right. Did you have one, Cynthia?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, so we did the research that looked at kids who either ate organic or conventional food that Joel was showing this morning, and that did the intervention with kids who were eating conventional and dropped down to organic. And all of that research was entirely funded by the EPA. And then after that, they invited us to come and talk about it, and I have a fellowship funded by the EPA to look at the effects of organophosphates on neurocognition in the elderly. So it's not entirely ignored even at the funding levels.
They're certainly not evil, but I agree with Brad. It's the people, the worker bees in EPA have impressed me. It's the political appointees at the top that if you're lucky, you have Carol Browner, and if you're not, you're not. And they change at the whim of the next administration.
And my question was
Let me
intended
just-
to
let me
say
just-
EPA was bad, because I have funding from EPA as well.
Yeah, it's
Let me just comment, though, on experience I had when I was still there, that you fortunately sort of counter to. When I was there, they came out with a new strategic plan for research at EPA, and as it went through it, it was very clear that none of the research would support epidemiologic research such as what you're doing. And so as chair of this committee, I asked two questions. One is I said, well, if children are 20% of our population, I would really like you to identify 20% of your research that goes to children, which they weren't able to do. But the other question I asked is, why are you saying you can't fund epidemiologic research? And the answer was, well, we don't have the epidemiologists in EPA, so we can't evaluate it. Therefore, we're not going to support it. Now, fortunately, since then, there's been a little bit of a change, but you know, that was a very entrenched attitude. And, you know, as I've done a lot of epidemiologic research, it's a very powerful tool. Anyone else? We have another question. Way in the back, yes, ma'am.
Way in the back. I understand that there's over 89,000 different chemicals that have been approved for use by the EPA, and yet only 200 of those have actually been tested by the EPA or a third party.
Yeah, that goes
in that
back,
time.
Yeah, that goes back to the Tosca issue, and in fact, you're right. People throw out different numbers, but they're in the 60, 70, 80,000 different chemicals. Very few have been tested,
And most of them have been grandfathered in.
Yeah.
and they've been grandfathered in. So that's correct.
Also, for example, chlorinated tris, which is a flame retardant, which is taken out of children's clothing because it is highly carcinogenic, still exists in the foam that it goes in your couches, your chairs that you sit on every day.
Yes.
And hasn't even been shown to reduce, it's not effective for what it's intended for. Right? It doesn't even provide the protection.
But it's still in
for
there, and we're exposed to it
All
every day. Our
provides
children
is
are
profit
exposed
for
to
the
it every
company that
day.
makes it.
Are there lists that farmers could access if they're not certified organic and they don't have the market to become certified organic and they're not going to go that way? Are there lists that farmers can access to look at not only the active ingredient but also the Roundup and what its effects are? No, I really don't want this.
No.
Or not.
Yeah, I don't know if you attended the Pesticides 101, but the so-called inert ingredients, which are what are in Roundup other than glyphosate, there's no way to access it.
Is on California pesticide labels, they talk about this contains known carcinogens. There's a law in California that that's got to be on there. It does. Would that look?
One of you said you worked on Prop 65.
Would that look at the inerts or no?
No, when a chemical comes before the committee, you're only evaluating the active ingredient. You cannot consider the formulation, and oftentimes you don't know what the formulation is because it's proprietary.
And we have listed a few of the inert ingredients that are on EPA's allowed list of inerts. And so some of them have endocrine disrupting properties. But it's a huge list, and we have not investigated those altogether as a class. So there's a great gap in our knowledge there.
Me again, just quickly, Beyond Pesticides does have a database that lists active ingredients, as like we mentioned, we don't have access to any ingredients, called the Pesticide Gateway. So if you go to our website, under the info box, you will see Pesticide Gateway. You can click on that, and we have over, I don't know, 200 or 300 active ingredients on there. When you click on one chemical name, say 2,4-D, you would get a profile for that particular chemical. So you would see an example of products that use 2,4-D as the active ingredient, a list of known health effects associated with 2,4-D. So for example, cancer, reproductive health, endocrine disruption, etc. And also a brief profile on what its environmental fate and impacts are. So it's a very good database if you guys are looking for a quick overview of an active ingredient's human and environmental health effects.
One of the other things that Beyond Pesticides has tried to do, we do have various projects related to not in the farm community, but this is sort of fits with that, for getting pesticides out of health facilities. And we've done a lot of work in Maryland on that. And we're using integrated pest management, IPM, which is, can be used in the agricultural setting without going totally organic. One of the problems we've had is the whole sequence of things you do with integrated pest management. At the very end, if it all hasn't worked, you're supposed to use least toxic agents. And we've tried to construct a list of least toxic agents, and it's not possible. Because whenever you start to look carefully at an agent, it's toxic. So it's a real problem even in doing IPM in a way that allows at the end a use of least toxic agents to decide what's not toxic. So it brings us back to the don't use pesticides. Does anyone else want to comment?
Brief comment about why do you have inerts, in quotes, in your mixtures. There are two primary reasons why inerts are used. Firstly, you've got to get the chemical into the organism. That means you've got to get it through the surface of the organism, whether it's an animal or a plant. There's always a waxy surface that's keeping many of these things from getting in. And so one of the two categories of inerts are what we refer to as non-ionic solvents or fat-soluble solvents. You put that on your skin, it'll go right through your skin. The other primary route of entry into an organism is through the breathing apparatus. And the breathing apparatus, there's always a thin film of water which has surface tension. And so the other category of inerts are surfactants, which weaken the strength of that surface tension and allow more rapid penetration through the respiratory surfaces. Then the active ingredient typically is designed to be two-part molecule. Part of it is fat-soluble, because you've got to get the molecule inside the cell to kill it. And the way to do that is to have part of your active ingredient, or maybe the active ingredient compounded with some of the inerts, so that you can dissolve in the cell membrane and get through the cell membrane. Once you get inside the cell, then you want to take advantage of the water-soluble part of that molecule, which has always electrostatic charges. That's what gives you water solubility. And the electrostatic charges will be attracted to anything of opposite charge. So if you have a pesticide with a negative charge on it, it'll always be attracted to positive charges. And the cell is full of positive charges, calcium ions that we heard about this morning, and many other things. And so the possibilities are just endless in terms of the impacts that you can get from a pesticide molecule. And that's why I like to refer to them basically as molecular bulls in a china shop. That's what happens when you get inside the cell. The possibilities for interactions are almost infinite. And this is why any kind of these kind of molecules are going to be biologically active.
Who's next? Yes, sir.
Do Do you know what the status of organophosphates since they banned consumer over-the-counter organophosphates for use in homes and so forth? How much are they used nowadays still?
Yes, she knows more about organophosphates than anybody in the room.
So, you know, the OPs replace the OCs, and they're starting to be replaced in agriculture with the permethrins and the pyrethroids. But of the total insecticide use in the U.S. in agriculture, they still make up 30%. So, and the main ones that we're still seeing are the ones that we used to see a lot residentially. So chlorpyrifos, diazinon, and then malathion and azentosmethyl.
And in the, I'll just add, I'm trying to remember whose study it was. Was it Rao's study? But they would, at Columbia, were doing a nice prospective study on personal exposure with mothers in a cohort. And right around 2000 is when they banned home use of chlorpyrifos. And there was a dramatic immediate drop in the biomarkers of exposure in the mothers and their offspring when we banned it. A nice little illustration of how public policy that can very effectively reduce our exposure. But as you said, it's still being used a lot in the agricultural setting, and it's being replaced, of course, by other things. Pyrethroids are likely to be slightly better. Certainly, organophosphates were somewhat better than organochlorines, but that's something. But there's always something new.
Yeah, now we have neonicotinoids. There are two things you might want to look at there. One is you heard this morning about the NHANES data. You actually can go to that and look at the patterns over time of OP metabolites, and so you can see what it gets done every 10 years. So there's several cycles of chemicals, so you can see what's getting into people, and you can see there's been a shift. And actually, there is published on the EPA website pesticide usage by year that's broken down into categories, but it's not very specific. And one of the things beyond pesticides it tried to work on is usage notification or usage, how do you say it, reporting. And there is pesticide usage reporting in California, a bit in Oregon, and they just voted down a bill, or voted into, Jay, what's the status of the pesticides in Maryland?
It was studied.
It became a what?
Study. They're going to study the bill.
Okay. There was a bill in the Maryland legislature this year to report what pesticides are being used, really in an aggregate, not on the individual farm, but there's been a lot of resistance to that.
They're doing it in Texas this year.
They're doing it in Texas now?
I think another thing that really speaks to the reduction in use in residential settings in the OPs is that now really all of our OP exposure is coming from food for people who don't do farm work. And a study that we're about to publish is looking at taking questionnaire data on what people eat and then predicting their exposure levels. And we're finding that just based on knowing how often you eat every kind of different fruit and vegetable, and then looking at the USDA's pesticide database of the residues in grocery stores, we can predict your exposure when we measure it in your urine.
And, it's only a small bit of good news, but the reason some of that happened that you may be aware of, that we haven't talked about in this meeting, is in 1996, there was a change in the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act and the FFDCA, which is the Food and Drug Law, which is called the Food Quality Protection Act, which required EPA to look at aggregate and cumulative exposure to various chemicals, aggregate being all sources of one chemical, and cumulative being all with the same mode of action. And actually the reason we got most of the organophosphates out of household use is that was the heaviest exposure. And when you added household use to food use, or exposure, household exposure to food exposure and other sources of exposure, it was way above what was considered acceptable. So they were really forced to get rid of chlorpyrifos and diazinon for home use because of the Food Quality Protection Act. So that was one little bit of good news, actually. Other questions? Way back. Yes, sir.
Okay, so so from sort of like organismal perspective, you've got you know, a lot of these regulatory feedbacks that can be disrupted by pesticides, and I'm sort of thinking, you know, speaking metaphorically on sort of like, you know, community health level, it appears that, like, you know, one of the you know, one of these big problems is this feedback of cost externalizations for profit, to facilitate more cost externalizations. And so sort of from a, I guess, I don't know, it's like maybe superorganismic community health perspective, is there anything sort of being considered in terms of what sort of, you know, constraining feedbacks, either in policy or in sort of economics, could be, I guess, you know, sort of legislated to moderate these things, so more organically than, you know, a lot of different fingers in the dam.
Mr. Rock gave me the microphone. I completely agree with, if I understand you, that it's a complex system and that there are many costs and burdens associated with the way we currently produce food that are not getting back to the people who are doing the production. So it's all driven by profit. I don't know what the answer is, except to think of a couple of examples, like Superfund law, which is the polluter pays sort of approach, or tobacco companies that were forced to contribute money to tobacco cessation programs and treatment programs, and that's usually come out of lawsuits, like the flight attendants, family stuff that supported the AP's Julia Richmond Center. I think that carbon taxes, of course, it's like a dirty word, but you know, finding out a way to make an estimate of the cost or the burden in dollars and put that burden on the corporations that produce, in this case, pesticides. I don't know an easy way to do that, but I think fundamentally and sort of conceptually that's the right approach. You know, it's like taxing soda. It's all the same thing, right? It's have the real cost borne by the people who are doing it. And then, of course, the companies might make different choices about what they produce if they knew they were going to get nailed with a lot of fees and costs.
So as a follow-up,
like Superfund, which is my first right, Superfund, the polluter pays. So you could say Monsanto is the polluter, and they should pay, you know, for all of the health. They should cover, you know, half of our Medicare expenses.
Excuse me. Part of the problem, as I see it, seems to be endemic in how the whole situation is working. There's a revolving door between government and industry. It's been ongoing for decades. You've got people who used to work for Monsanto who are now at the highest levels of the regulatory agencies they head up. And so in my mind, there's a great deal of conflict of interest there. And I'm sure there's a great deal of collusion and efforts that go into making sure that their product is pushed on the American consumer. So you have chemicals like DDT, Agent Orange, PCBs, on and on, which have been approved, and then only to find out later that they're horrific on the human system. And we're still dealing with the fallout of that a long time later. You know that they're currently working on, and I guess they put aside for a year, a Dow GE corn that has the derivative of Agent Orange in it. Now that just sounds wrong to me on so many levels. So at what point do we say as a consumer we're not going to take anymore? And how do we change that process?
Well, unfortunately, you know, Citizens United doesn't help, that's for sure.
No, it doesn't.
You know, in the long run, sort of, a good friend of mine always talks about the importance of the Supreme Court in these decisions. So your vote counts, I think, and the administration does count, and the effects, particularly when it gets into the judiciary, is very durable and lasts a long time. So those are, you know, very, very important. You know, for instance, thinking about who we vote for and who we support, given the current makeup of the Supreme Court, it's very tenuous, right? If the two older members get replaced in another administration, say to follow this one, that happens to be very conservative, we could end up with a very biased Supreme Court for decades. That's biased in a way that I would not be comfortable with. So all of those things are important in how we advocate. Obviously, Beyond Pesticides as an advocacy organization is how one of the routes to being really involved.
So, Jay come forward for just a minute? What's the current number on the proportion of food that's now organic?
It's about 2%, it's growing.
It's about 2%. I keep telling Jay, and I told Joel last night, that my feeling is that if we, as consumers, as opposed to scientists and policy people, can get the organic systems up to somewhere between 10 and 15%, then we think there's going to be enough clout among the organic community to begin to change some of these things in law and policy and agencies. But and all of you can help with that, to the extent we encourage organic growing of food, consumption of food, and get the percentage up to where it really it's a big enough percentage that people have to listen to us, we're going to win. But,
I think you're asking the key question, and it's the kind of question we want to ask at a conference like this after hearing from the experts on the science, because we would hope that the science would drive the policy, which would drive the practice. The science is supposed to be independent of politics and shouldn't be politicized by the decision-making process. But of course, the laws that govern the science and the way science is used are written in a political venue. And so our challenge is to create venues in which decisions are made in a fair and open sort of way that really takes science into account. And I really believe we've done that with the Organic Foods Production Act, which was passed in 1990. I mean, it is a law that is science-based. It requires scientific review of allowable materials in organic. And every day, petitioners from industry, whether it's the infant formula industry or the food industry, are coming to the National Organic Standards Board and saying, we want you to allow this material. And thankfully, at this point, most of them are being turned down, but I can tell you the argument is being made with increasing strength that the only way you're going to grow organic and make it mainstream to that point of percentage is to allow some of these materials, which are starting to sound more like pesticides, into the system. The only way we're going to fight that is if we use the system that's created under the Organic Foods Production Act, which is you can get on our website, Beyond Pesticides, and look for Keeping Organic Strong. We have a web page which will give you the background on how to engage in this process. And you should follow all of this on the National Organic Program page at the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service website. Anybody that's concerned about the problems you heard about this morning needs to be vigilantly involved in what USDA and the National Organic Standards Board does. That's our future. That's our only, as far as I'm concerned, it's the best environmental law that we've got on the books today because it doesn't seek to mitigate risk. It seeks to identify hazard, and with a precautionary approach, seeks to keep hazard out of the system. It's based on building plant health as opposed to killing, as Andy Kimbrell said. It's the health industry as opposed to the death industry. It's the flip side of everything. I mean, this work, the work that you guys are doing has to go on because it helps inform the process. We have to be educated in this level of science because if, you can go to a farmer's market or a school that's doing IPM, or a hospital that's not using pesticides for their pest management, walk into their restrooms, and guess what? There'll be triclosan in the soap. So it's our job to connect the dots, to bring the science to the decision maker, and then offer them the alternative. It closes the loop.
Does your 2% include home gardeners?
No, it's commercial production.
I mean, the other nice thing about it from a consumer point of view is that the USDA organic seal is, at the moment, means something. It's reliable, and we know there's a process that reviews. So if it comes with that stamp, as opposed to all the other labels gets put on foods that confuse consumers, then they're unregulated. Here's one that means something, which is why it was so nice in the AAP's clinical report to focus on that and include that table, which I threw up at the end. What does it mean, and what are the other labels that don't have meaning? Here's something you can use. If it gets diluted, then it'll lose its credibility.
But we've got to engage the same these guys have to engage in that process as well. When the infant formula industry came to the Organic Standards Board and said, we want to allow all these synthetic accessory nutrients into soy formula, we were able to get the American Academy of Pediatrics to come in and testify before the board, make a statement. It was fantastic. We're having a big debate next week, as Rap mentioned earlier, on antibiotics that are still allowed in apple and pear production. The board has voted to take it out for the last decade, and they keep pushing the date back. And the Infectious Disease Society of America is coming to the meeting. That's the level of engagement we need to have in this process. We can't rely, as you all know, you've experienced, you pass a bill, it sounds great, then the work begins, right? Then we have to exercise our democratic involvement in that process to ensure compliance with the law.
The other thing that the organic label does is it in itself educates people, because a lot of people don't think this much about food as we do. And so by even just seeing, oh, that's organic, oh, that's different from my regular food because my regular food has pesticides on it. And so the other thing that we're finding in terms of how many people eat organic has really grown since the label. So in our population, which is a population-based sample of 7,000 people, 5% say they try to always eat organic, and another 35% say that they eat organic at least sometimes. Right. So the 2% doesn't speak to the number of people that are starting to think about this issue.
Right.
Good point. We are at the end. I want to thank everybody, all of you, for all your interest and enthusiasm and passion for this, and I want to thank all of the panelists for participating. Thank you very much.